All right, welcome, friends and comrades. Daniel is back again with a very special interview with Andrew Hartman, American historian at Illinois State University. Andrew, welcome to Emancipations. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on, Daniel.
So, we are here to talk about Andrew's latest book called Karl Marx in America. And this is a 500-page, two-day force examination of the entire sweep of Marx's presence in the United States and leading up right very much even to the present. You end the book talking about thinkers like Andres Malm, William Clare Roberts, Bhaskar Sankara, the contemporary left. And you offer might call it kind of a periodization, certain moments in history where American liberals, American leftists, American conservatives, American reactionaries across the political spectrum confront Marx. So, first of all, congratulations on this achievement. It's a very comprehensive book. I mean, it feels to me like an important book that just sort of could be continued, like a scroll, like a palimpsest, constantly
Yeah.
being revised, right?
Yeah.
And of course, you have to make a lot of decisions about what to include. A lot of this is intellectual history. A lot of this is intellectual biographies of figures that you probably a lot of people are not too aware of, men, women alike, etc. And one of the things that really sparked my interest quite a lot was how Marx first became a threat in the United States was really associated, you document towards the beginning of the book, with the Paris Commune of 1871. And it was that event, the first moment that the European working class in France took control of the government, albeit just for a very limited time, ended tragically. But Marx and Engels were associated with that event as ideological leaders of it, right? And then globally, the ruling class sort of saw labor agitation in the United States as Marxist. So it almost kicked up the first Red Scare. Could we perhaps start at that moment? And we can also go back. We don't have to be too synchronous, or we can be asynchronous as well. But I felt that was an extremely interesting moment. Tell us about the effect of the Paris Commune in the United States to kick it off here.
Yeah, sure. So US historians are used to thinking about the first Red Scare as that being after the First World War and the Bolshevik Revolution. And that's probably one of the most violent and repressive Red Scares in US history, maybe the most violent and repressive. But they're not used to thinking about what I would categorize as these mini Red Scares that happened prior to then, beginning first with the sort of threat posed to global capital by the Paris Commune. And it was beginning then that Marx's name began to be used in association with events that sort of threatened the rule of order, so to speak, threatened the rule of capital. Marx was the intellectual leader, or one of the intellectual leaders of the International Working Men's Association, which is also known as the First International, which forms in Europe, specifically Brussels, in 1864. And, Marx is from London, working to sort of like formulate the plan of this organization, which had chapters in as many as 15 countries, including the United States. And it was thought by many that the International had some role to play in the Paris Commune. It did not really. So the things are there's not a real sort of political association, but it was easy to blame them because they had been sort of stirring the pot in several countries, and thus easy also to blame Marx because he's the person who's kind of writing the platform of the International. So this is the first instance of this. You then find, at least in the United States, in the 1877 Great Railroad Strikes, the press is sometimes blaming Marx The Haymarket Affair, Marx gets blamed in 1886, which is the first of a long line, a tradition of blaming Marx for things that happened after his death in 1883. And so, that's like a sort of interesting subcurrent in the book, is that not only are lots and lots, a surprising number of Americans reading Marx favorably to sort of make sense of their situation, there's this undercurrent that sometimes comes to the surface of a Red Scare, with Marx's name always invoked in any kind of Red Scare in the U.S.
Yeah, I wanted to start with the Commune in part because I felt like that was the moment in which Marx really enters the American political scene. Now, of course, Marx's comments and his letters with Abraham Lincoln, his engagements with this quote unquote Second American Revolution and the Civil War bears some discussion, and you discuss it. But I feel that your book is very much interested in not Marxism as this abstract sort of interpretation on American history or social formations or whatever, but actually how have Americans absorbed the ideas of Marx, right? So and that's what's I think, very unique about your work here. So tell us, so that you also have W.E.B. Du Bois creating this book called Black Reconstruction, and he argues that you had something close to an American version of the dictatorship of the proletariat following the U.S. Civil War. Can you explain what Du Bois meant by that? And can you explain Marx's view on the U.S. Civil War period? Just kind of give us a sort of overview of that.
Sure. Yeah, Du Bois wrote this book, Black Reconstruction in America, in 1935. I think it's Du Bois's masterpiece. I think it's one of the 5 to 7 best works in U.S. history ever, and has only really been sort of rediscovered in the last maybe 25 years by U.S. historians, and read as not only a interesting primary source, but a very substantial sort of piece of scholarship. And this was a period in Du Bois's life when he had begun reading Marx very seriously. He had engaged in sort of like correspondence with a whole bunch of communists or Marxists in the U.S., black Marxists, like Abram Harris and others, and was trying to sort of figure out what Marx was all about, and was applying some of what he had learned in reading Marx to Black Reconstruction. So there's lots of language that's coming straight out of the sort of 1930s Marxist left, such as the notion that the enslaved undertook a general strike during the Civil War, and that is that they threw down their tools and they all quit working, and when possible, swamped Union lines, recognizing well before Lincoln probably that the Civil War was a war for their emancipation. This is exactly how Marx saw the Civil War, and so he was engaged in a lot of correspondence during the Civil War and wrote several long essays about the Civil War. And he was extremely interested well before the Emancipation Proclamation that Lincoln made, which essentially declared that it was going to be a revolutionary war for emancipation. Marx was extremely interested in the idea that the war could only be successful if it was about emancipation, and that was in fact the greatest weapon that the Union had. And so he'd had this correspondence with Engels. Engels was a student of military history, and in studying the war was much more interested in the fact that it seemed like the Union was being outflanked militarily, and Engels was deeply pessimistic about this. And even though that was true, Marx kind of kept Engels' spirits up by pointing out that the Union had yet to play this card, and that is, you make it a war about abolition, you basically have millions of people within the Confederacy who are going to fight for the Union cause. Not to mention the fact that Marx had this correspondence with lots of his German comrades, the 48ers, who had fled Germany, many people had fled after the failed 1848 revolutions. Lots like Marx ended up in London, but many ended up in the US. And as they did, they often, as Germans, went west. And so several, such as his good friend Joseph Wedemeyer, ended up in the Union Army, was in fact a general in charge of the theater in St. Louis, or in charge of the Union in St. Louis during the war. Marx kept up a correspondence with them, and they were very interested from the get-go in making this a war about the abolition of slavery, a revolutionary war, if you will. When they first came to the U.S., they were intent upon perhaps returning to Europe very quickly to sort of restart the revolutions that had failed in 1848. But by the time you get to the late 1850s, they had discovered that they could have a revolution, a revolutionary politics in the U.S. through anti-slavery. And so this is how Marx conceptualized the war, and that's how Du Bois ended up conceptualizing the war and fully fleshing it out in this remarkable book, Black Reconstruction.
Thank you for that. It is quite remarkable, the 48er presence, because one of the things you note is that there was also a lot of utopian socialist communes around this time, and even before, even earlier, even pre-Marx, right? Building off of like Owen's thought, for example, right? Or even like forms of Prodeunism, right? And you talk about the way that Bellamy's looking backward a little bit later, but around this time in general, situates kind of like a extremely important perspective for how intellectuals on the left would confront Marx through a distinct American prism. And I wanted to sort of ask you if you could tell us, how did intellectuals around this time, you know, as we're moving into the Gilded Age, but right before it, how were they beginning to confront Marx's teachings through a kind of, if you like, American lens? Like, you know, a lot of later like new left theorists would sort of say, well, in Thoreau and in Emerson and the Transcendentalists, you can see a lot of resonance with Marx. That's very interesting. It's very speculative. But actually what you show, right, is that during this time, and many of these names are forgotten to us, there were actually American Marxist philosophers, American Marxist practitioners that deeply engaged Marx, but also sort of like fused Marx with other socialist traditions. Could you perhaps introduce us to a few of these people that you talk about during this period and how they thought through Marx?
Sure. So Bellamy's an interesting figure because his very famous book, which sometimes is still read, Looking Backward, not dystopian, but rather sort of utopian. The ideal society that Bellamy imagined was what he called nationalism. But when you look at the configuration of that society, it really was socialism in the Marxist sense, in a sort of like early Marxist, early socialist sense, late 19th century sensibility to it, in terms of like shared wealth, collective ownership of the means of production, a democratic state that controls the economy. And he recognized, I mean, so I think he had a very Marxist view of things, but recognized that calling it socialism, or much less Marxism, in that context, so we're talking the 1880s, was not going to gain him the wide readership in a US setting that he otherwise received. But he was highly influenced, for example, by a Danish-American immigrant by the name of Lawrence Grundland, who was a Marxist, became a socialist, was living in Chicago and kind of in the Midwest as part of this larger sort of Nordic or Scandinavian immigrant community, many of whom became pretty radical. Some of them moved into anarchism, but Grundland had read Marx in the original German, had read Capital, and was very interested in explaining Marx for an English and American readership, and wrote this great book, which is highly influential and probably has been forgotten, and it's called The Cooperative Commonwealth. And like intellectuals across the spectrum in the Gilded Age were reading this book and sort of trying to make sense of it. Grundland is one of these people, I argue, became the first like Marx explainers or Marx interpreters in an American setting. It seems like across the long history of Marx reception in U.S. history, there are these people who take on this role of explaining Marx for an American audience. I would argue like our great Marx explainer now is David Harvey. He's probably taught more Americans how to read Marx than anybody in the history of the long Marx reception through his podcasts.
YouTube classes. Yeah.
Yeah. So Grunland gave a particular reading to Marx that was highly popular in this setting, and others followed suit as well. And that is, it's the late 19th century, and so a growing number of people are interested in trying to understand like the laws of nature, right? So this is like the apex of people reading and interpreting Darwin. So you get some interesting and also nefarious interpretations of Darwin. This is the sort of age of Herbert Spencer and social Darwinism as well. These types of like trying to systematize our understanding of society and humanity is extremely popular, and Grunland does this and sort of applies Marx and Darwin to understanding society. And this is kind of, out of this you get a sort of scientific socialism. That's what Engels eventually calls it. The laws of history can be understood through the lens of Marx. And so Grunland is highly attuned to Marx's labor theory of value. In fact, that is the key piece of Marx's whole oeuvre that gets used by an increasingly militant working class and socialists and various socialists in Gilded Age America. You know, the most famous thing Marx ever probably wrote about the working classes from the Communist Manifesto, when he and Engels argued that they were going to be the vanguard of the revolution. But in that time period, amongst the large German and other Northern European immigrant groups, they were reading serialized versions of Capital, right? They didn't have a full English interpretation of Capital, but they're putting like chunks of it in their various journals and magazines and sort of passing these around. And the most well-read or famous chapter of Capital is the chapter on the working day, in which sort of Marx lays out his analysis of how a struggle for a shorter working day, or a struggle over your very sort of like labor in the working day, was part of the larger class struggle. This was very, this resonated with people at the time. And so Grunland is applying that and sort of making the case for a more orderly society of the sort that Bellamy would then articulate in Looking Backward.
That's very interesting. And, you know, in a certain way, it's interesting that once you get socialist parties emerging around this time as well, you have a debate internal to them about, which is a debate that still exists today, about the extent to which Marxism and socialism should be bookish or not. And so most famously, of course, this appears in the IWW, the Wobblies, Big Bill Haywood. I never needed to read Capital because I have the marks of capital all over my body, is his famous kind of phrase, which you could interpret as an anti-intellectual phrase, although I'm not willing to necessarily do that. I think anti-intellectualism actually emerges from the right more so, but nonetheless, a lot of it is, like you said, Frederick Engels wrote The Condition of the Working Class in England actually before he met Marx. And that book, I think from a distribution standpoint, in terms of like readership, probably far exceeded what people read compared to Capital. We often forget that, I believe. And like you said, it wasn't Ernest Unterman, very interesting figure we'll talk about in a moment, the first translator of Capital. When did that come about? Like 1903?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So anyway, so I find that very interesting. So what's the common reference point? Even for a socialist like Jack London? Of course, it's the Communist Manifesto. But Engels somewhere said something very funny when he visited the U.S. He said that the American socialists are so theoretically sophomoric or rudimentary that even the Communist Manifesto is too difficult for them. You may remember him saying that, which I don't think was a real, sincere point, a kind of offhanded thing, whatever. But still, nonetheless, what accounts for that question? You see what I mean? Which is this kind of maybe you could call it kind of an ever-present historical trepidation amongst the working class movement in America to possess a kind of allergy to theory. Because Marx is the hardest. I mean, Capital is a hard book. It's a hard work, right?
Yes.
That's part of its allure, that brings us into it. Could you talk about that? Maybe the sources of that, and how Americans are unique? Again, I don't want to say anti-intellectual, but help us piece that together, if that makes sense.
Sure. So obviously, the influence of Marx and Engels on much of the European working class socialist movements has a tendency towards like theorization, bookishness, I would argue. Think a sort of classifying your movement activities and all in very theoretical through a theoretical lens, and sort of always having recourse to theory with Marx as the key figurehead here. Now, lots of the early socialists in the US were German immigrants who had the same impulse. And that, I think, then becomes sort of like that also manifests in the fact that lots of the Jewish immigrants to places like New York City, they got heavily involved in the socialist movement by sort of like getting acculturated into German socialist culture in New York City. And there's the same sort of bookishness and high theorization in those early socialist communities. But there's always a tension there with a much more sort of like, I guess, prosaic, pragmatic American working class impulse that runs throughout American history. So much so that, like the most famous 20th century American philosophy is philosophical pragmatism, which, you read John Dewey, Democracy and Education, also not an easy work, but the basic point of pragmatism, at least from Dewey's perspective, is that no theory is worth its salt until you put it into experience. So there's always been a sort of emphasis on experience, on the ground things in the US. I think this comes to a head with the Wobblies. So the Socialist Party of America, which forms in 1901 with Eugene Debs as its, like leader and perennial presidential candidate, mixes together. I mean, Debs was probably the only person who could bring together all of these different types of socialism in the US, a wide range of them. And so there's the sort of like high intellectual side of things, which you see with the Clark Kerr Company, which is a socialist publishing organization out of Chicago. They're the ones who hire Ernst Unterman to translate all 3 volumes of Capital. So he gets the first translation of Capital, Volume 1, into English for an American audience in 1903 or 1906, I want to say. Soon after, writes this great little book that explains Capital. Again, he's one of the Marx explainers. And so there's a very sort of book clubbish aspect of the Socialist Party. But of course, there's so many other aspects of the Socialist Party. The state with the most members of socialists in this time period is Oklahoma, which will surprise people. I kind of always have a trivia question for my students when I'm teaching about this time period in US history. And I ask them, which state do you think had the most socialists? Those with just a rudimentary knowledge will say New York or Wisconsin, but it's Oklahoma, which is a product of a sort of hangover of populism, lots and lots of sort of tenant workers, landless tenant workers who are seeking some sort of alternative to the two-party system, move from the People's Party right into the Socialist Party. These are not necessarily bookish people. Like, some of them might have read Marx, but they kind of saw Marx as a Jesus-like figure, or even a Thomas Jefferson-like figure of somebody who was like going to fight for them to gain access to the land. And so the Socialist Party has all these different iterations within it, some of it anti-intellectual, or maybe that's too strong of a word, but some of it's
Right.
sort of like anti-bookish.
Right.
And the Wobblies, I think, move in that direction because the sort of like base, the demographic base of the Wobblies are like Western miners who are extremely militant. They're the ones, much like Big Bill Haywood said, that wore the marks of capital on their body more than anybody. I mean, that was like the most exploitative industry in the world, perhaps at the time. And they knew what they needed to do or what they wanted to do to gain sort of working class power, and it had a very Marxist perspective on that without necessarily having gone through reading The Working Day from Capital.
Yeah, because a lot of the debate that Haywood would have with Debs, with Louis Freina, with other Marxist figures revolved around questions that still concern the left today, which is, violent overthrow at the mode of production or not, elections or not, electoralism or not. And Haywood and most elements of the IWW were militantly opposed to reformism. And so revolution and reformism at this moment was this sort of question, right? This is sort of at the height of the Second International period, which is a very interesting period intellectually because you also have in Marxist thought, you mentioned John Dewey and even William James, a lot of fusion, a lot of Marxist thinkers that are fusing, even like Thorstein Veblen, right? These kind of liberal historiographical conceptions with pragmatism and a certain conception of Marxism. So you have Walter Lippmann, a young Walter Lippmann before World War I. You even have John Dewey himself, obviously, in the mix of these debates. And then you have a very interesting thing happen, which is that in the United States, the First World War, unfortunately, saw a split within the socialist movement with a huge contingent, mostly of liberals, basically embracing the war, I think by the majority. And I always found it very interesting that the important liberal publication, The New Republic, is sort of formed right after World War I. And its foundation sort of leaves the Marxists in the dust in a certain way. And then, of course, you have the retrenchment of the New Masses, which is basically, as you say, the magazine of the working class. And they're basically doing working class centered stuff, which is distinct from the masses. So, I guess for my listeners, this period is such a rich period. And it's really interesting how, when you look at these figures from Debs to Daniel de Leon, to Louis Freina, to Ernest Unterman, to Jack London, they're inspired by Bolshevism. Bolshevism is happening even before 1917. If you are a socialist, your focus is international. So you're aware of Lenin to some extent, right? You're going to be much more aware of Lenin after 1917. Could you introduce actually Daniel de Leon to the fold here? I think it's important. He's not talked about a lot. What I found interesting about him in your portrayal here is how he was trying to redefine Marxism in relationship to the American Revolution. And this idea of resurrecting a revolutionary Thomas Paine, for example. A lot of new left historians, I think, tried to do that as well a bit. We don't see that much anymore. I think actually Michael Hart wrote a book on Thomas Jefferson, which was pro-Jefferson from a Marxist point of view. Talk about that. Like how are these Marxists like de Leon trying to sort of make the claim that actually, no, Marxist thought, philosophy, principles, the worldview of Marxism is in line with the American Revolution? How did that work for him?
Sure. Yeah, De Leon's a super fascinating figure who becomes sort of known to many as the megalomaniac of the socialist movement. He becomes the leader of the Socialist Labor Party by the 1880s, and was instrumental also in the formation of the Wobblies, the Industrial Workers of the World, although gets kicked out of the Industrial Workers of the World because he's because he's always interested in sort of taking the leadership mantle of these organizations. He just had a very sort of like powerful, distinct view of what it meant to be a socialist revolutionary in that time period. And you know, his use of the American Revolution to me is a little bit curious. It wasn't really like a sort of rooted in a like distinctly Marxist understanding that, well, maybe that was like the bourgeois revolution that we need to further continue. But he believed that there was this revolutionary spirit running through American history that we needed to continually spark. And so like he was, you're right that there's this tension that we're still living with between reformism and revolution, between electoralism and direct action, if you will. That was a like huge tension in the early 20th century, and De Leon is kind of like in the midst of that. And he wasn't necessarily against electoralism, but he believed that a Marxist or socialist political party, and this is what he tried to make out of this Socialist Labor Party, should constantly be burrowing into American institutions, especially labor unions, which is something that eventually other left-wing parties like the Communist Party is going to attempt to do as well. Just a fascinating sort of early figure of the American left who's kind of like has his hands in all sorts of these debates at the time.
That's very helpful. Thank you. And I suppose, you know, Debs takes up a huge portion of your book, and we would be remiss if we didn't throw Debs onto the table, because of course it's very interesting that he is the figurehead of the Socialist Party, but he had to balance the reform and revolution dichotomy internal to the party, because while the Socialist Party was grounded in Debs, which Debs represented sort of the left-wing flank throughout the majority of that time, it was also engaged with a lot of reformist efforts at a local level of getting, you know, what's called sewer socialism, getting socialist candidates elected at a local congressional level, even more local than that, townships, etc. What accounts for Debs's role there, and how was he permitted to remain the figurehead of the party, even though he is a sort of dyed-in-the-wool Marxist? Because again, a lot of the socialists were not necessarily Marxian socialists. And then later, after the Pullman strike, which I think is very interesting biographically, he fully commits to Marxism. And then eventually he, with the Zimmerwald left, he becomes like an anti-World War I figure, and stands out as almost like, and I think this is what makes him a world historical figure, because he had the ethical fortitude to take that position. He took the Leninist position, right? Mm-hmm. So my question to you is, how was Debs permitted to remain the leader, even though he was of the far left? Does that make sense?
It totally makes sense. I think because in addition to being eventually a committed Marxist, you know, when he goes to the Woodstock prison in Illinois after the Pullman strike because he violated a federal injunction, going to prison makes him like a working class hero across the nation. But it's also in prison that lots of socialists, Marxists visit him, and famously sort of put in his hands all kinds of Marxist literature, including supposedly Capital. And Debs later recounts that was the time when he became a Marxist. You know, historians or biographers disagree, but eventually at some point by the late 19th or early 20th century, it's very clear that that Debs sees the world in a very Marxist sense. And yet, as you say, when the Socialist Party forms in 1901 out of the wreckage of a bunch of other failed socialist parties, and they sort of come together to form this party, they know that they're not going to be able to have any cohesion unless Debs agrees to be sort of the leader or figurehead of this party, in part because he was a working class hero and was famous for that, but also, and in part because, you know, he was born in Indiana, and so he really kind of spoke the language of middle America, if you will. But that's partly what made him a political genius. He was an effective politician, at least insofar as keeping together the Socialist Party. because he could appeal to the more sort of Marxoid side of the party. Many of these German immigrant types or Jewish immigrant types who were deep in the literature of Marx. He knew how to speak to them. He knew how to appeal to them. They looked to him as their leader. But at the same time, having grown up, I guess what you might say in the American heartland, growing up with the traditions of small R republicanism, the American Christian proto-social gospel, populism, he could speak that language as well. And so when he was speaking, for example, to a group of socialists in places like Oklahoma or Missouri, he could speak their language. He could talk about how this was what Jesus wanted effectively. So even as he moved to the left politically or ideologically, he was still an effective politician. And I mean, that's why the party nominated him for president 5 times. It's why he was able to get millions of votes, even in 1920 when he's running for president from prison. And I think that, so like during the Gilded Age, there's a sort of crisis of the two-party system. There's a political crisis. Neither party, both parties are unable to solve what's known at the time as the labor problem, in addition to assorted other problems associated with capitalism. And there was like a real sort of moment, a ripe moment for the Socialist Party or a socialist movement to emerge potentially as one of the two major parties. But both the Democrats and Republicans picked up on the need to reform. And so you get the progressive era Democratic and Republican parties, which essentially co-opt certain elements of socialism, just enough in terms of trying to sort of bring order, control to an unruly capitalist system that makes it, that sort of renders the Socialist Party less resonant with lots of people. And then, of course, World War I, the Bolshevik Revolution, and the Red Scare, I think, just like destroy that moment for American socialism.
Yeah, there's a very big question that I have for you, and I was debating when to bring it up, because I was thinking that the moment to bring it up would actually be when we look at the Cold War and Louis Hartz's, the Hartzian argument. But maybe I could actually bring it up now, and we'll talk about Hartz later, which is, that Marx and Engels had some optimism about the possibility of American revolution to communism, precisely because America does not have the residue of a feudal past. And that becomes sort of like the central question, right? For liberal thinkers as well as Marxist thinkers. And I find that very interesting, especially once we have 1917 occur, because in a certain way, 1917 is well, first of all, it's on the margin of the world system. It's in Russia, so-called backward, sort of more undeveloped bourgeoisie, and it's fully ensconced in a kind of a feudal aristocratic form of leadership and rule. It was deeply oppressive, and therefore very, very foreign to the United States. But still, nonetheless, the Bolshevik moment captivates the left, captivates Marxists. And could you speak, because you have a whole chapter on this, Marx becomes Bolshevized in the American imagination for liberals and Marxists alike. And, you have figures like John Reed, you have later the John Reed reading clubs, which I find interesting. And you have developed, thinkers like Max Eastman. If people have seen Warren Beatty's Reds, of course, this is very well portrayed. And you also have one of the most important things. We'll get to the revolution thing in a moment, but I think it's related to the 1917 question, because 1917, like we started with the Commune, but 1917 is the Marxist revolution that is successful, right? That actually transforms the state in some sense, right? And so therefore, it reorganizes our understanding of what Marxism can do in the world. And so talk about the effect that might have had, because at first blush, America is quite different than Russia. We don't have that feudal past. But still, then, nonetheless, like, I was reading Christopher Lash's dissertation on American liberals' reaction to the Bolshevik Revolution, and he really shows how deeply influenced they were by it. And we can talk a lot about that, because it's at that moment that I think, in a certain way, everything changes. It's like a pivotal moment.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps this is a good time for you to bring in the Bolshevik question, how it influenced the American Marxist milieu. In a way, it probably made American Marxism a lot more intellectual. Like we were talking about that, right? Because it also, you have this, bohemianism is introduced, right? And so on and so forth. So talk about 1917 first, and then second, we'll get to this question about, can American Revolution be thought through a Marxist lens or not? So let's address that later. But talk first about, how did 1917 affect the whole scene here?
It really is pivotal. Not surprising. I mean, the Bolshevik Revolution was pivotal on a world stage. So as I've kind of discussed, there are all these sort of like socialist, potentially revolutionary impulses popping up all over the country in the lead up to the World War I era. And the Socialist Party of Debs had been able to sort of effectively capture it, even though that didn't lead to any type of like real political power, except in a few cities like Milwaukee, with the sewer socialists. So there's a lot of radical energy. You're seeing this with the Wobblies. You're seeing this with, like, for example, really, really militant socialists in Oklahoma who are like desperate and willing to march on Washington. World War I begins to tilt the federal government. It gives the federal government, and also especially state and local governments, the excuse to crack down on militancy. The World War I basically allows the state and local governments to destroy the Wobblies, for example. So even before the Bolshevik Revolution, there's an added sort of climate of repression against the left that is changing the equation. And so, like, people on the left, in order to remain on the left, are kind of having to rethink how to organize, because they can't do so in a sort of like popular or populist setting anymore, because the government is cracking down on them. The Bolshevik Revolution, then, of course, here's especially those who had been reading Marx or had been a part of a sort of like understanding themselves as a Marxist international movement. This was it. Marxists, socialists, communists, the left had captured the state in a, okay, yes, backwards, but very large, geographically speaking, country. This was the key. And so people across the political spectrum are looking to Russia as to try to learn something and applying that in an American context. The right looked to it and said, okay, we have to crack down on our left now. Otherwise, we're going to have our own Bolshevik Revolution. We can't have that. Not a very good understanding of what was happening in the US by them, but to repress a left that you had long wanted to repress. Liberals, as you mentioned, Christopher Lasch's sort of brilliant dissertation and first book on the liberal response to the Russian Revolution. They had an assortment of responses to it. Some of them were quite impressed by the early results in Russia, but many, many more, I would argue, sort of are appalled by what's happening. And you even get this out of some socialists. And so this is like this, eventually, soon after the Bolshevik Revolution, you get the split in the American left. The Socialist Party takes another route, which sort of goes more towards liberalism, so much so that by the time you get to the Cold War, the Socialist Party would be pretty anti-communist. And then the other side of the left, which is formed by the more militant side, the John Reeds, but also the many sort of like foreign language organizations, so lots and lots of Eastern Europeans who closely identified with the Bolsheviks, they moved to the left and eventually, out of an assortment of different formations, formed the Communist Party of the United States. And look to the Bolsheviks and also look to the sort of repressive setting in the United States and decide that they need to be much more serious about organizing like an underground revolutionary movement, which many people have argued, and I think there's some truth to this, that that was not the right approach in an American setting, even if the government was being highly repressive, because Russia and the U.S. are very different. And this does go back to a sort of like ongoing debate Marx had in his mind about the U.S. Early on, he thought that socialism might come to the U.S. through the ballot box, because the U.S., way before lots of European countries, had, well, universal suffrage, of course, limited to white men, but a form of suffrage that, Marx said, well, eventually, of course, they're going to usher in socialism through the ballot box, because why wouldn't they do that? Here's an opportunity for the working class to take power. But of course, Marx was oftentimes much more pessimistic about the possibilities of democracy in the U.S., and much more so than I think many people, especially his critics in the 20th century, recognize. Marx has changed his mind a lot. Like, even towards later in his life, he really thought there were a lot of possibilities in Russia, despite the fact that it had not had much capitalist development, because of the commune movement, right? And so, Marx changed his mind about the U.S. a lot. Marx also changed his mind about sort of when to sort of press the button of reform and when to go straight to revolutionary. And part of the fact that Marx wrote so much, had such a capacious life, intellectual life, and changed his mind a lot, made it possible for people across the 20th century and beyond to sort of read their own politics into Marx, or read Marx into their own politics.
Yeah, thank you for that. In one of the debates pre-World War I that people should research hinged on this question of the meaning of what's called at the time the corporate commonwealth. And there was this idea that the corporation as a form could actually be sublated into a socialistic form, right? It could be transformed. And a lot of thinkers sort of put their trust in that idea, including like Walter Lippmann, right? The First World War changed that thinking. And in a way, I think because of state repression and because of the fear that the Bolshevik Revolution stoked in the bourgeoisie and the ruling class, a lot of that kind of commonwealth, that sort of Bellamy hangover, right? Which had a certain optimism to it, right? Seems to get, and correct me if I'm wrong, that optimism seems to disappear in a certain way. And as you say, the socialist movement divides itself between a more militant side. And it is interesting that Trotsky himself sort of is involved with this moment of this split internal to the American socialist movement. And I thought maybe you might want to say something about that. If you've seen Reds, you see that debate where Louis Freina, I think it's in Chicago, where the split happens, and then they show how John Reed had like also a romantic split that was concurrent to that, and that in fact Reed really was sort of not necessarily a pariah, but maybe in the minority. So the Bolshevik position was not necessarily to be understood as like the position, although over time perhaps it retains a certain principled sort of strength. Could you talk about how Bolsheviks, including Trotsky and maybe even followers of Lenin, begin to actually themselves influence the direction of American socialism? Because in a certain way, I mean, we already saw with the 48ers, right? Like European intelligentsia comes to the US and literally shapes the strategy. Could you talk about perhaps Trotskyism here? Because I do think that Trotsky emerges extremely important figure, right? And a lot of Trotsky's followers, and this is something I also want to talk to you about, they do end up abandoning Marxism, right? Like Max Eastman, right? Or, James Burnham, or, Sidney Hook, right? We can talk about that too, but perhaps talk about how Bolsheviks literally influence the strategy at this point. You already mentioned John Reed, but could you say more about that?
Yeah, sure. And I do love that scene from the movie Reds. Louis Frena, played by Paul Sorvino, brilliantly. It's like a little bit part, but that's such a good movie.
And
Yeah,
Frena was kind of like a robust and serious Marxist theoretician, right?
very much so. People often called him the American Lenin because he was theorizing in 1918. Was writing about writing a Marxist interpretation of imperialism as the sort of cause of the First World War, and then by the 1930s he'd changed his name to Louis Corey in as a sort of Americanization, but maintains his Marxist chops and is writing these rather brilliant analyses of capitalism and why it was running into crisis, reading Marx through Keynes as a critique of Keynes.
He was also writing about like value form debates in a way before we even had those debates, right? Because he was
Yeah.
a serious student of capital. I mean, again, it's very strange that he's not read. I think perhaps he should be, his book should be republished, perhaps.
Well, hey, if this book can accomplish anything and get people to sort of turn to some of these figures, look back to some of these figures, I'd be quite happy with that. Frena, one of many. Yeah, so like Trotskyism has a huge impact on the American reception of Marx and the left in general. It's really interesting because, of course, the turn towards Bolshevism, the formation of the American Communist Party, the Communist Party has many sort of like iterations across the 1920s and 1930s, but the Communist Party is, of course, part of the Comintern, the Communist International, and it's not always correct to say that it's just working at the behest of Moscow, but it was working in close coordination with Moscow, and so because of that, and because there were lots of American leftist intellectuals who disagreed with Stalin for a variety of reasons, Trotskyism seemed like the logical home or the logical place for them to go. But even that was a little bit curious because, like, if you're a leftist in the United States in the 1930s, say, and you're not a Stalinist, and you don't want to be a part of an organization that might be taking its orders from Moscow. So there are many options, but it's kind of curious that Trotskyism is the option because, in a way, yes, Trotskyism is the most sort of like famous resistance movement on the left to Stalinism or to the Soviet Union. But if you're an American leftist, you would think you're more interested in sort of questions about the left in the United States, questions about capital in the United States. But Trotskyism was probably more interested in the internationalism of the left and events overseas, perhaps even than the American Communist Party, even though the Communist Party is associated with Stalin. And so, like, Trotskyists were obsessed with the question of Stalinist Russia and really sort of like formulated their whole sort of understanding of politics through that obsession, for better or worse. Many, many brilliant Marxist scholars. I mean, Trotskyism to me is sort of like an intellectual movement, which then sort of went in many different directions. And as you said, many of them moved to the right, particularly when they had decided that the Soviet Union was irredeemable. And that's when they broke with Trotsky, because Trotsky, even though he was Stalin's greatest enemy up until his death in 1940, always thought that the Soviet Union was still a worker state. It just had to be sort of like regathered or recaptured from Stalin. Many, including Burnham, including Hook, including Eastman, they broke with Trotsky before that. And so, but they sort of retained these intellectual habits of mind. Their analyses, even after breaking with Trotsky, breaking with Marx, still read like sort of Marxist analysis, even if their political valences have sort of moved away from the left. and I think it also bears saying, so like, well, there are lots of people on the left in the 1930s who did not move right, but some of the most famous did move right. Many of them were Trotskyists, and it was just easy to do so. So like they might have had both personal and political disagreements with what was happening on the left, whether in the US or internationally speaking in the Soviet Union, or even with Trotsky himself. But also, once you started to move to right, especially during and after the Second World War, especially during McCarthyism, all kinds of worlds opened up to you professionally, career-wise. Your life was made much easier, I would argue. And so that sort of shift is both understandable at an intellectual and political level, but also at a more sort of social, opportunistic level.
Thank you. That, I mean, part of, I think this is also perhaps the Bolsheviks allow for a redefinition of what the Marxist intellectual's vocation is. What I mean by that is that now, like if you read like Victor Serge's accounts of Bolshevism, he has this phrase or this idea that really the Bolsheviks were kind of like savants. You know, they were kind of experts in everything. I mean, you talked about how Debs read Marx in jail. You know, Trotsky wrote 3 books in jail, got married in jail, was imprisoned 3 or 4 times. Actually, make as this total side point. I have taught in the jail before today, you know, and it is so wild to me that when you study the history of revolutionaries being imprisoned, how much they accomplished when they were in prison intellectually. And now a lot of prisons don't even allow people to read books.
Yeah.
I don't know if you're aware of that. It's a total side point. It's
No,
very tragic. But there should be like a history of how the other thing about prisons, by the way, is how often prison escapes that used to happen.
Yeah.
Right?
No, the prison's become much more effective in its totalitarianism.
If Foucault is right.
Yeah. Like just to add to this, I agree with you. It's remarkable, like the things that someone like Gramsci did in prison.
Right.
And then Angela Davis, I analyzed this long article or essay she wrote in prison in 1970, a sort of like Marxist analysis of the family and gender. It's a remarkable essay, and that she wrote it in prison in 1970. It just kind of blows my mind.
Yeah, so that's a side point, but back to the thread here. Talk about the Great Depression. You know, let's kind of zoom out a little bit. Talking about intellectuals. You said that 1934 was seen by many Marxists in America as a potential revolutionary year, right? You already talked about how 1876, the Great Railroad Strike, was a revolutionary year. So you have these kind of year, you know, 1848, 1871, 1870. Why is 1934 so significant? And you say also, and you get this from Mike Davis, the late historian, at this moment, this is the sort of the height of Marxist study, Marxist practice. It's where theory and practice are all unified. And of course, it's kind of building to the New Deal.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, you know, cue up Bernie Sanders saying, oh, yeah, socialists brought the New Deal. Well, so did Marxists, really. But tell us about 1934 and the Depression.
Yeah. So I kind of periodize these times in American history when lots of Americans are reading Marx favorably and kind of what that means. And I describe these as Marx booms. The first Marx boom was, of course, in the Gilded Age with the emergence of American socialism. The second, and probably the greatest, is the 1930s. The response to the Great Depression by the working class, in this sense, was rather remarkable. You see the emergence of mass industrial militant unionism unlike any other time in U.S. history. So, like you said, Mike Davis refers to 1934 as the high water mark of class struggle in U.S. history. 1934 is, of course, when you have a general strike in San Francisco kicked off by the dock workers. 1934 is the year when textile workers across the eastern seaboard from Maine on down to the Carolinas are on strike. This is happening everywhere, in part in coordination with the Roosevelt administration's first New Deal, which, even though the Supreme Court struck down its struck down the part of its New Deal in which it sort of like said, okay, unions can now, or workers can now collectively bargain. The workers kind of took that as, well, we're taking our cues from Roosevelt here. This is during the sort of early formation of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which moved away from the sort of like craft unionism of the American Federation of Laborers and went towards industrial democracy or industrial unionism. We're going to organize everybody in this industry across the board, regardless of what work they do, regardless of race, even sometimes regardless of gender. And so there's a mass militant labor movement, on top of the fact that there's just sort of dissatisfaction across the country at an ideological level for the first time, really mass speaking since the Gilded Age. You see social Darwinism lose its grip, and so people quit blaming themselves for their own misery. It's in this context that lots and lots of intellectuals, probably more than ever before or since, are reading Marx, trying to sort of interpret Marx for an American context. So this is when you get, to me, one of the greatest books written by an American about Marx, and that's Sidney Hook's Towards an Understanding of Karl Marx, which is published in 1933. And that's just one of many, many. There's just so much literature coming out about Marx. So there's a sort of like cohesion between this militant unionism and intellectual ferment that is very Marxist. At the same time, you have a government that recognizes, with FDR as the leader, that something serious has to be done to bring order to the chaotic situation of the Great Depression. You had all these Marxist intellectuals who were turning to Marx to understand, to make the case that capitalism inevitably generated these crises, and that eventually it was going to generate a crisis so tremendous it was going to bring the whole system to collapse. And so we had to be ready on the left to sort of replace it. FDR and his so-called brain trust, they kind of saw things similarly. They were not Marxists. They were not socialists. In fact, they were very explicit about the fact that anything they had to do had to prevent socialism from taking hold, prevent Marxism. They said in private and sometimes in public often that their job was to save American capitalism. But FDR and others recognized that in order to do so, they had to sort of, to some degree, be class traders. They had to turn against those capitalists who were forming the American Liberty League, those capitalists who did not want any kind of government regulation and just assumed that this was just part of the inevitable process or sort of cycles of capitalism, and that like the working class might have to suffer for a while, but we'll come out of it. FDR did not think in those terms. And so he kind of injected a dose of socialism, a dose of Marxism into the system. It's kind of what you get at the New Deal. And the second New Deal was highly effective in this sense. And with the National Labor Relations Act, for the first time in U.S. history, the federal government is no longer sort of explicitly on the side of capital in the class struggle with labor. And many unions, many workers now see FDR as representing them. You know, there's signs at like strikes and protests and pickets, like FDR wants you to join a union. And this has a twofold effect. It makes the labor movement that much stronger at the national level, that much more sort of ingrained in the political institutions in DC and elsewhere. But on the other hand, it definitely sort of like sops up the descent of this high water mark of class struggle and brings the militant labor movement into the fold of the New Deal and the Democratic Party, and allows the Democratic Party to establish majorities going forward for the next 40 some odd years. It even brings the Communist Party to a certain extent, at least during the Popular Front stage, into the Democratic fold. One historian refers to the Communist Party during this time period as a junior partner in the New Deal. Intellectuals follow suit, and there's less attention to Marx as in the second half of the 1930s during the Popular Front stage, and this kind of carries into the post-war era. There's less focus on Marx as necessary to understanding American society, and more a focus during the Popular Front period on sort of like building up these sort of American heroes, the Emersons, the Thoreaus. So in this context, you see the emergence of American Studies, which is a left liberal project, but not Marxist.
Yeah, this is where we get an intellectual sort of series of incoherence and perhaps confusions begin to emerge. And I think it's very interesting that you're making a kind of causal point, that a lot of that can be understood through the more practical fact that, yeah, Marxists were aligning with liberals in part to address the rise of fascism, it must be said, right? Because that is one of the core motivations behind the Popular Front. On the other hand, it's also interesting to me that Stalinists become intellectually non-dynamic in American context because they are so caught up within a kind of bureaucratic conformity. And therefore, it's not a surprise that the Trotskyist contingent will produce intellectuals that are giving us works that are more intellectually stimulating, because they're able to challenge the status quo. They're able to go against the consensus more. I want to actually ask you about Sidney Hook here. He's a difficult figure to read, just like Burnham is, and to some extent, just like Max Eastman is, precisely because, and even like Eugene Genovese is, right? I struggle to read these figures. You know why? Because they abandon Marxism. They abandon their core principles, and it becomes tragic. So first, two-part question. Tell us about Hook. You said his book is one of the most important in the 20th century, at least in America. Why is that the case? We know that he was a philosophy professor in New York along with James Burnham. They were kind of very important figures. Tell us about Hook, maybe also about Burnham, but also, have you thought about, or have you derived a kind of explanatory theory regarding this betrayal of Marxism by these figures, from Genovese to Burnham to Hook, etc., etc.? We can't just blame it on Trotsky, you know. So that's a bigger, more speculative question. But first, maybe you could talk about Sidney Hook for listeners that may not know who he is.
So Sidney Hook, in the early 1930s, was the only self-identified Marxist working in an American philosophy department in higher education in the United States. And like I said, wrote this, what I consider a brilliant work towards an understanding of Karl Marx, published in 1933. And he had, as a student, studied in Berlin in the 1920s, and also had studied in Moscow. He had impressive language skills, so he was reading a bunch of Marx that had yet to be translated into English, including the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, so the young Marx, so-called. And that aspect of Marx's work, Hook could easily sort of meld with what he was learning as a student of John Dewey's in terms of pragmatism. The notion that the pragmatic notion that any theory worth its salt had to be sort of worked out in experience. Hook thought that worked nicely with the young Marx's critique of an emerging capitalism, even though Marx isn't using that term yet, but it's sort of like Marx's understanding of the fact that humans were alienated because their labor was not their own. Hooke works all of this out in really sort of interesting fashion, and even goes against his teacher Dewey, who never embraces Marx. Not even sure Dewey ever reads Marx, but goes against Dewey in the sense that he says if Dewey really followed his pragmatic philosophy to its logical end, he would embrace Marx, because clearly capitalism in practice is not working. Hooke never joins the Communist Party. In fact, is turned off by the Communist Party because they are harsh. Like the Daily Worker reviews his book and is extremely harsh in rather dogmatic fashion in its review, claiming that, you know, pragmatism is a philosophy of the bourgeoisie, and says something like Dewey doesn't know Marxism, and sort of Eastman, who is also critical of Hooke, because by this point, Eastman already is turning against Marxism. Eastman's not dangerous because he doesn't know anything, but Hooke's really dangerous because he knows pragmatism and Marxism, and yet he's sort of advancing this bourgeois philosophy under the guise of Marxism. So, like, Hooke's really troubled by this, not just because it's an attack on his ideas or his book, but also because from his eyes, this is a sort of like anti-intellectual understanding of his pursuit. So he's very turned off by the Communist Party, even though he wants to be in that orbit, because in the early 1930s, even on through the Popular Front period from 35 on, if you're a left-leaning Marxist intellectual, you want to be in good graces with the Communist Party if possible, because that whole the movement that orbited around the party was where all the action was. But he realizes pretty early on that's not going to happen for him.
So
And
he didn't follow like James P. Cannon or any of those splits.
No, he wasn't really involved in that. Yeah, as far as I know.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. So then,
So I don't know that he ever like even. I think he sort of considered himself part of the Trotskyist orbit, but I
yeah,
don't even know. He didn't join any parties, as far as I know.
got it.
So he's kind of a dissident Marxist in the 1930s. But both, if I have a sort of like overriding theory of change of why these people on the left move to the right, and I don't know if I have an overriding theory because the particulars are often different,
Right.
but especially in the middle of the 20th century, the Hookes, the Burnhams, the Eastmans, so on, there are lots of them. One of the things, okay, so like at the same time, being in the Communist Party, if you read many of the histories of this, was a full-on 100% life commitment for many of these people. And I would never use the word cult, but there's some cult-like aspects of it in terms of like following the discipline of the party. Your whole life, it centers around the party. And so at a personal level, people who get turned off by that might get turned off of the whole project. While at the same time, international events are proving to them, in their eyes, that Marxism might be wrapped up in atrocities committed around the world, especially when they learned the sort of like full revelations of what Stalin was doing. So like if you're a Trotskyist, or if you're a dissident Marxist like Hooke, you might not be surprised that Stalin's committing crimes in the name of revolution or in the name of Marxism. But once the full extent of the purges or the crimes are revealed, I think it's shocking even to the likes of a Trotskyist. And so then you start these people started questioning everything, which has made all the more convenient when a repressive state and a repressive culture turns against Marxism and embraces. The one thing that the right always does is it embraces the ex-Marxist. And so, like, for example, William Buckley Jr. always took the ex-Marxists into the fold and allowed them to write and basically become famous writing for National Review. Whittaker Chambers is a good example of this as well.
So they have a material incentive.
I think so. And, they wouldn't have admitted it at the time, but of course that has to be a part of it. Life gets a lot easier for them when they become turncoats.
So tell us, that's helpful. Thank you. I think it's naive to think you could develop well, rather it's ahistorical to say, oh yeah, here's one theory for why people betray Marxism. Has to be understood in a situational context. Moving to state repression, one of the things I've talked about on my program is the Congress for Cultural Freedom. Now, a lot of people on the left, I am critical of saying like maybe they overestimate its influence. I wanted to get your temperature on this. What was it, and how transformative was it to the movement of within Marxist intellectuals? So what it was, I mean, just briefly, was a kind of CIA-funded arts and humanities effort globally that tried to recruit dissident Marxists, but also real Marxists, and really kind of turned them ideologically, turned them right. With black authors like Richard Wright. They funded James Baldwin, for example. So it's quite insidious if you think about it in reality. And we know a lot more now about it than people knew at the time, right? Because if you think about it, if you have a brilliant black writer, you have a brilliant working class writer, and here is this program saying, oh yeah, we will give you a livelihood to write. Oh, wait, that's the CIA. Oh my God. This is nuts. So what's the story with this? And how do you gauge its real foothold or footprint on, within intellectual life?
So this is when the CIA at a cultural level was really smart in their activity, I would argue. So understandably, in the early Cold War period, Marxism in the U.S. had been mostly crushed. It wasn't a real threat in the U.S., which is, of course, ironic because this is the period of the biggest Red Scare in U.S. history, McCarthyism. But Marxism is still very real as a project in Europe. There are large communist parties in countries like France and Italy. It's still sort of an open question as to like what degree some of those countries might turn towards communism in the immediate years following World War II. And so lots of intellectuals in that context are Marxists. What the Congress of Cultural Freedom wants to do, and I think many of its leaders would have been very committed to this, whether the CIA was funding them or not. What they want to do is create a sort of like sense that you can be on the left, but not be communist, not be Marxist, that there was revolutionary energy coming from the US, coming from the West. And
was Hook an advisor on this thing?
Oh yes. Yeah. And it was as was Dewey, as was Irving Kristol, like a whole host of people who might have been Trotskyists or might have been leftists or Marxists during the 1930s were a part of this project. They probably better understood how to speak to European leftists and Marxists than anyone else. And they really sort of emphasized the cultural freedom that you could have in the West that you couldn't have, say, in the Soviet Union. That's why, like, Jackson Pollock gets funds from the CIA, this is like a cultural outreach on the part of the CIA that probably was highly effective in the sense that they're building up a non-communist intellectual left in Europe that had close transatlantic connections with people in the US. And yeah, go ahead.
I have a clarifying question. In a way, it seems strange that all of these leftist intellectuals would even cooperate in the first place. Is that owed to the fact that, like Marcuse, for example, they all had to fight in the Second World War? So was the Second World War the kind of context that permitted this to continue, in the sense that it was a full war, a total war, and everyone had to play a role, had to pitch in? If you're an intellectual, yeah, you're still playing a role, right? And so you have the OSS, the precursor. Is that why? Does that make sense? Because now there's no way. I mean, I could never envision any kind of like public cooperation at this level. But even like if you look at like Adorno knew that he was publishing in a journal funded by CIA. That's bonkers by today's standards. But what permitted it then? Was it the Second World War?
I think so. Yeah, no, totally makes sense. Yeah, I guess there's an open question as to, well, a couple of things. The CIA, as we now think about it, is not how people in the 1940s would have thought of the CIA. Like, all of the dirty deeds of the CIA had not really sort of, most of them had not yet happened. And so, especially in the context of World War II, when even Marxist intellectuals, in order to defeat fascism, are openly working for the state in its various iterations, both in Europe and the US, maybe it's just they're seeing things in those terms. I mean, I think it's a good question. I think it's an open question to what degree they all understood that what they were doing was being funded by the CIA, or whether, if they knew that, it was like that was obviously not the thing that was going to keep them from doing it. But yeah, I think a lot of it, like our horror at the idea of leftist intellectuals working at the behest of the CIA, is in some respects a product of what we now know the CIA was and has done that they didn't know.
That's fair. Yeah. That's why I always admire those thinkers that refused it, even though they didn't, like Jean-Paul Sartre.
Yeah.
They tried to recruit him. Like, those thinkers interest me a lot that refuse that. I want to now pivot to going in somewhat loose chronological order here, what you call the New Left humanizing of Marx, and say a few general things about how you periodize the New Left, how the New Left period transforms our understanding of Marx. Because in a certain way, when you say Marxist humanism, it's very interesting, even going back to Sidney Hook's, because, people should realize that Marx's early work, the 1844 manuscripts, German Ideology, was really released in the 1930s for the first time. And so the humanist Marx blossomed really in the decades following that, right? And so you have, like, the Johnson Forrest tendency with C.L.R. James and Raya Dunouskaya. You have these, but then you also have the New Left. The New Left is a huge thing. It's almost so big that it's hard to sort of pinpoint. But how do you pinpoint its influence on Marxism in general, in this wider story you're telling?
So I think in a U.S. context, the 1960s is the period when there's a flowering of a multitude of Marxist interpretations, or a multitude of sort of ways to read Marx. That has only persisted since then, and like kind of persisted in the 70s, 80s, and 90s in an academic register. There's like a mushroom effect. And it really does start with, as you mentioned, the Johnson Forrest tendency, Raya Dunouskaya and Grace Lee and C.L.R. James. Raya Dunouskaya and Grace Lee are the first in an American context to offer English translations of the young Marx. They began doing that in the 1940s. And out of their serious readings of that, and a sort of like anti-Soviet Marxism that's rooted also in maybe like existentialism, they form what they call Marxist humanism. Now, I think you correctly say that Marxist humanism, without calling it as much, was probably a part of other traditions going back to Sidney Hook, or maybe in a European context going back to Lukács, potentially even Gramsci. But they really make it a thing and make it a movement. Dunouskaya publishes a book called Marxism and Freedom in 1962, which becomes widely read and reviewed in the burgeoning New Left press. And she makes the case that Marxism is an American thing. She really focuses on the fact that 1776 was like the beginning of a humanist expansion that only picks up pace with all the various other iterations and that Marx elaborates on. And she sort of relates, at the time, the Montgomery bus boycott to Marxism and this sort of humanistic, we're all just sort of working for working class emancipation type thing, without a sort of like, it's almost Hegelian in the sense that the resistance is going to sort of like push us forward rather than a sort of like specific form of labor analysis that earlier Marxists might have had. This type of Marxism is highly appealing to young new leftists because, I would argue, they're not working in a sort of labor context. Most of the new left are not in labor unions. They might be students. They might be involved in civil rights activism, eventually feminist activism. They're not necessarily working in labor unions. And so that aspect of Marx that emphasizes the labor theory of value is not something that's highly emphasized during this time period. So you get this humanist Marx that's emphasized. You also get a sort of new version of an anti-imperialist Marx. This is not necessarily the sort of like anti-imperialist Marx of Lenin or Louis Freire, but rather a focus on the theory of primitive accumulation, which Marx lays out in the first volume of Capital. And that is that things like imperialism, colonialism, slavery, genocide are the idyllic, the sort of like idyllic conditions, the idyllic setting for the development of capitalism. And they start applying this theory to their understanding of things like Vietnam. So there's this like anti-imperialist Marx that emerges. You also get
monthly review, right?
Yeah, big time. Monthly Review is, like a fascinating journal, because to me it's like one long essay that's been going on since 1948, and it's been very consistent, I think, in its approach towards Marxism and socialism,
but very centered on an anti-imperialist footing.
Yes.
So that makes sense. The labor theory of value gets deprivileged. You also have the rise of the new middle strata, the new middle classes. You also have the rise of a new class of bureaucrats, the professional managerial class. And so the class composition changes in the New Left period. And I think Marxists have to respond to that fact, right?
Yeah, so you see the emergence, for example, of state capitalism as a new thing to analyze. C.L.R. James had written a book on state capitalism, and then you get like the young intellectuals who formed around Studies on the Left out of Madison, Wisconsin. These were people who were deeply ingrained in Marxism, Western Marxism. Some of their professors were of the Frankfurt School. One of their most influential professors was also William Appleman Williams, who's taking a sort of anti-imperialist approach. And they innovate a theory of corporate liberalism. Corporate liberalism for them is this sort of like state capital coalition that is formulated in the Democratic Party or around American liberalism that is responsible for a sort of bureaucratic capitalism, also responsible for things like Vietnam.
And then you also have Genovese and Lash and the kind of Marxist historians, which Gabriel Rayburn at Harvard University is writing a book on Genovese, and I interviewed him because, again, like Hook and Burnham, he's a tragic figure for me, because I think that a lot of what he wrote, Genovese, is, Roll Jordan Roll and his understanding of slavery and so on. It's like very, and correct me if you see it differently, ironic in the sense that he's almost an influence on what would become 1619 in a weird way. Imagine that, right?
Yeah.
Because he's the one that's putting the agency of the enslaved people onto the table for the first time through Gramsci. Okay, that's a whole other side point. But back to the thread. Okay, so you have the New Left. Talk about how the Black Panthers and the kind of Black radicalism out of the civil rights fuses with Marxism. We must address this point because it remains a sort of through line to the present, I believe, right? The disillusion of reformism of the civil rights movement. How does Marxism relate to the civil rights movement? I think this is essential. And obviously, the theory of the lumpen proletariat and the theory of revolution that Huey Newton and Eldridge Cleaver develop is fundamentally Marxist at its core, right? I think this needs to be thrown onto the table. Can you fit this into the wider narrative here?
Yes. So in part because Marxism and its American reception is no longer rooted in the labor movement during the 1960s, and it kind of flowers in all these different directions. You get lots of what I would call these hybrid readings of Marx. Now, this has been true across the U.S. history of reading Marx, but it really becomes much more paramount during the 1960s. And I guess the civil rights movement into Black nationalism, which also takes on hues of Marxism, is a really good example of this. In part, they're Marxist because Marxism is international, and they start relating their struggle to like struggles elsewhere in the world, Algeria, Palestine, and Vietnam, and so on. But also, in part, there's this notion that, okay, so Marx was on their side, on the side of revolution, and sort of right about a lot of things. But one aspect that Marx couldn't have foreseen is that the working class would become sort of encrusted middle class, an encrusted middle class. And so then we have to turn to other people as the agents of revolution. That's the sort of analysis of the lumpen proletariat that someone like Huey Newton would really grasp onto, but also so would others like Herbert Marcuse, who, you know, like the Frankfurt School in this context is also coming to needing to sort of come to terms with the fact that the working class has failed as a revolutionary agent. And so if there's going to be revolution, they have to sort of find it in other avenues. And like Marcuse says, that the agency of revolution in the United States is like this black underclass or lumpen proletariat. Right.
Yeah, this is something we discuss on my show quite a lot, and that I've written about. And, you know, it's something that, in my opinion, hasn't aged that well. And I think, if anything, perhaps after 2008, we're seeing like a movement of Marxist thought back to the centering of working class agency, which is a big thing we could talk about. But in your chronology, you introduce this sort of like, you know, because really in the mid 1970s, everything is revealed about what happened with Stalin. Gulag Archipelago is published, and you have in France the 68ers begin to become publicly and visibly anti-Marxist, the rise of the new philosophers. And then you have, you know, figures like Leszek Kołakowski publishing Main Currents of Marxism, a book which everybody should read. Don't be afraid of it. It's actually worth reading. I spent the time to read it, and I've done podcasts on it. I'm very familiar with Kołakowski. He's a Polish Marxist figure. I might do some future programs on him, because one of his, when he was a Marxist, he wrote this really cool essay called The Concept of the Left, which I adore. But nonetheless, Richard Rorty said that his book, Main Currents of Marxism, something like effectively killed Marx in the academy. And Marx is reinvented in the academy in the late 70s, 80s, on through the 90s. In some sense, based on everything we've said, it's really tragic, what happens here. So one question I could ask you, Andrew, is sort of like, what do you see as positive about the academic overhaul of Marx, right? Because you talked about how the New Left was like blossoming and like, you know, all so on. But I mean, at least the New Left had a foothold in practice. Academic Marxism gets a bad rap these days, probably deservedly so. But maybe not. Do you have an optimistic reading of academic Marxism? That may not be the best sort of phrase for it, but what happens in this moment of really the triumph of liberalism, right? Neoliberalism, right? The rise of neoliberalism. Because, you know, we didn't talk about the right here, and von Mises and Hayek, but Kołakowski as well, right? These figures that intellectually try to extinguish the dialectic, the labor theory of value, extinguish orthodox Marxism. To what extent were they successful?
Yeah, because Kolakowski's The Main Currents was like massively popular amongst the American right and many liberals, like you mentioned.
And Rorty. It's a book that systematically goes through by name every single Marxist and attempts to show the fundamental intellectual hypocrisy and errors in all of their thought.
Yes.
Including Althusser, including Lukács, Lenin, you name it. Right?
And the whole first volume's committed to Marx himself. Yeah. And I analyze that. I try to analyze that at length in at the beginning of chapter 8 of my book, which is about the academic left. And I kind of put Kalokowski in conversation with Michael Harrington, who's trying to keep this sort of political labor-centric Marx alive in this context, ultimately probably fails to do that, although I would argue Harrington's getting the last laugh lately. So the academic Marx. My hopeful or positive interpretation is that because Marx wasn't really being read anywhere else than in the academy for a good 20 to 30 years, maybe it's the fact that the academy at least kept Marx alive. But there were so many sort of different and in retrospect, strange readings of Marx during this time period. My favorite reading of Marx by the academic left, other than the historians, which I quite identify with, and I think other than Genovese's strange turn, the historians who read Marx kind of kept true to a Marxism that I can recognize as a sort of like political historical Marx. One of the Marxes I really like that emerges is in the work of Frederick Jameson. You might say that he sort of like took the theory of commodity fetishism and spawned a whole sort of field of criticism, of literary criticism or literary theory out of that theory of commodity fetishism in terms of thinking about ideology and how humans are often don't know what we're doing. But on the other hand, as much as I adore Jameson and his interpretations, he made it extremely difficult for people outside of a narrow niche or a narrow field to engage with Marx, or at least the Marxism that he was writing. Like, it's this highly difficult material. And, without sort of like, I'm not one of these people who are like, Judith Butler's worthless because their writing is unintelligible. Like, I've made a lot of sense of it, and if I can do it, I think lots of other people can as well. That's how I feel about Jameson. But let's face it, there aren't that many. Like, reading Sidney Hook's Towards an Understanding of Karl Marx is much easier for most people than, say, Jameson's The Political Unconscious. So the academic Marx became like highly theoretical, highly elevated, and then it also, when it sort of merged with cultural theory, there's a sort of post-Marxism or anti-Marxism inherent there that you see revealed in, I would argue, Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism. And so, like, there's that move as well. Marx becomes, I mean, to be glib about it, just one of many dead white men, right? So Cedric Robinson, it's interesting. The book Black Marxism, or The Making of the Black Radical Tradition, was published in 1983. Did not make much of a mark at the time. A new edition was published in 2000 by the University of North Carolina Press with a foreword by Robin D.G. Kelly, who by that time has become a pretty famous academic Marxist of sorts. And so it begins to gain traction then. But really, it's since 2015 and the sort of early emergence of Black Lives Matter after Michael Brown is shot and killed in Ferguson, that book has just become what I would consider one of the sort of Bibles of an academic activist left. And two concepts that Robinson innovates in that book are racial capitalism, which is now like one of the most widely used concepts amongst academic historians and other scholars. Like, if you look at a Google Ngram of racial capitalism, it doesn't really pick up steam until 2015, and now it's just like skyrocketed. And then also his concept of the Black radical tradition. What I find interesting is that the book itself is not really Marxist. So, like, Black Marxism to me is the wrong title. It's a Black nationalist approach to understanding history that is often anti-Marxist, not just in its explicit critique of Marx, but also in its understanding of history and historical agency. But in any case, I find that book and others like it are highly influential amongst an academic left, that even to the degree that it's engaging with Marx, engaging with the likes of Jameson and other Marxist theorists like Terry Eagleton, perhaps, or historians like Eric Hobsbawm, is oftentimes sort of anti-Marxist either in a sort of like black nationalist sense or a feminist sense or sometimes a postmodernist sense, in that Marx is thought as, I guess, totalitarian. And so that's there's a common sort of anti-Marxism in the academic reading of Marx in the 1980s and 1990s and continuing on. That's part of the equation. And yet people are still reading Marx, and Marx is being kept alive in the academy at a time when, with the emergence of neoliberalism at the political economic level, with the emergence of a conservative movement, which first manifests in the Reagan administration, Marx was not popular outside of academia to make sense of the American political scene.
Yeah, that's helpful. I mean, in a certain way, there's a lot of texts that are hard to categorize because you have, say, Hart and Negri's Empire series in the early 2000s, right? Is that an academic Marxist book? Well, I would say no, because of, if we define academic Marxism as detethered from practice, right? As like caught up within problematics that are fundamentally interdisciplinary or that have ends of pure academic speculation, which we could accuse Jameson partially of doing that a little bit, but not in all of his books, by the way. I think there is, as it pertains to Jameson, a kind of orthodox Marxist shell inside of him that's always wanting to break out. But if you look at like Empire, it was hugely influential on the anti-globalization movement, right? So there are texts, and even Cedric Robinson's text has been, I think, hugely influential for a post BLM left. So that's very interesting, right? It's kind of like, well, academic Marxist books can kind of escape this seminar, and right, and then how we categorize them changes in a certain way. I see your contrast between, like, one problem with academic Marxism is that its audience, people to receive and absorb it, require advanced degrees, and that creates a certain hierarchy of knowledge. Whereas, like, a Sidney Hook is writing for a different audience, right? And here, Russell Jacoby's work on the death of the public intellectual is probably important in a certain way. And I feel that you are somebody that tries to write very cognizant of that audience question, and I admire your effort in doing that. The public question is huge for you. In closing, Andrew, I wanted to ask you, perhaps in a few decades, what do you think might be the future of Marxism in America, and what might stand out as the currents, right? Whether that be eco-socialism, whether that be degrowth communism, whether that be the revival of what we call on my program neo-Trotskyism, which is kind of taking this reform revolution debate and housing it within electoralism, right? In other words, the Republican tradition and Marxism need to be thought together, right? And so it's not so much as it's like an either or, but there has to be a fusion. And I think Jacobin magazine represents this, even though they get a very hard time from a lot of more ultra leftist folks, right, for being too reformist, right? But that's my question.
Too popular. Or part of it's that they're so popular. I mean, it's kind of like hard to be the king, and
yeah, there might be a bit of egotism, of course, at play with that, which is kind of pathetic, but a reality.
Yeah.
Because, for me, I think the interesting question, and we look back at the history of all of these currents, so Marxism is a revolutionary doctrine, right? And so, what's the distilled essence, right? What is orthodoxy, right? Becomes the question in a certain way. And yeah, it's valid. I mean, the New Left and the academic Marxists are saying, well, the orthodoxy of the Stalinists was partially responsible for its crimes. In other words, mechanistic dialectical materialism, the philosophy behind some aspects of Stalinism, was problematic. So in other words, then what is orthodoxy, but then the meaning of the debate about orthodoxy is almost like what propels Marxism forward. And we're having that debate now. We're always having that debate. That is the perennial debate in my view, right? So if I say degrowth communism is going to be absorbed by the liberal status quo, right? Which it very well could be. It very well could be, right? I don't know. I mean, that's a relative polemic for somebody to wage against them, you know? How do you think some of these tendencies might pan out? You know, what do you see as having a certain historical durability in the current moment? I know it's hard to predict, but perhaps you might speculate a bit.
Well, what I've seen in the reading of Marx since 2008 especially is a growing emphasis on freedom. Now, of course, can often be an empty signifier, or a floating signifier, but especially in an American context, like Americans have long been obsessed with the notion of freedom and what it means and how it's internal to our understanding of our national sense or national identity. And so, like, what I see is a growing number of Marxist scholars and activists and publishers and just people joining reading groups to read Marx. The focus seems to be, we're not free. And the thing keeping us unfree is capitalism. And all of the American political traditions do nothing to help us understand this basic question, why we're unfree and how capitalism makes us unfree. Marx continues to offer answers to that. And I think Marx will be relevant into the future as the sort of key figure or the key tradition, intellectual tradition that addresses this basic question of why we remain unfree, even in a nation that seemingly is dedicated to the never-ending concept of freedom. So, like, for example, in many of the books that have been published about Marx in the last 10 to 15 years, there is this focus on freedom. Like, it's read through an academic Marx, but the difference between what I'm reading in these books now as compared to, say, like the Jameson or whatever, the academic Marx of the 1980s and 90s, is a focus on labor. And part of this is experiential or practical, in the sense that lots of academics now see their own labor in much different terms than academics might have in the 1980s or 1990s, because so many academics don't have, they don't have secure jobs. They've joined unions. I'm in a union now, which is a great development. They've joined unions. They see themselves in sort of class-oriented terms, and they see the work that they do as labor, more so than maybe Marxist intellectuals have thought of their work as working class labor since maybe the 1930s. And so the question of labor and exploitation relative to freedom, to me, is the main sort of thing that will continue to persist. And to me, that's the Marxist, that's the orthodox Marx that actually still makes sense and we still need to grapple with. There are lots of other, I love your sort of like neo-Kotskian analysis. I hadn't heard that before, but I think you're right that the debate about reform and revolution is not going away, and nor should it go away. And I think we need an embrace of both. We need to look at how reform can push revolution, or how revolutionary activity can make for reform. I think that's, like, for example, Bhaskar Sunkara's book, The Socialist Manifesto, is like trying to sort of navigate that tightrope. The debate about Marx in relation to the environment or eco-socialism is a fascinating debate. I'm not sure exactly what side I'm on of that debate. But the fact that Marx is the canonical figure in the debate, and people are sort of parsing over Marx's letters and words from the 1870s in order to make sense of that debate, I find fascinating. So
that's, I know it's amazing that I studied with the French philosopher Alain Badiou, and I don't know if you knew this. I always make this point. He's not a philologist, but he got his idea of the communist hypothesis, which is a concept he's known for. You may be familiar with that. I don't know if you've read his book on it. From a letter that Marx wrote to Wedemeyer, the Civil War general.
Yeah.
Remember, Wedemeyer asks him, "What's your most important idea?" And Marx says, "Is the dictatorship of the proletariat." And he says it's not class struggle because the bourgeois economists had discovered that before me, and so on and so forth. But I found that very interesting. And even in Saito's Degrowth Communism, he's working with these letters, right? These like very particular points. So it's just interesting about like how serious Marx is taken to this day, you know?
Yeah.
And always will be.
Marx can't die as long as capitalism persists. I make that point in the book, but I truly mean it. And like, there's so much evidence. The evidence of that thesis abounds.
Well, Andrew, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for writing the book, Karl Marx in America. Everybody must acquire this book. What's the best way to acquire the book?
Hopefully your local bookstore. I've had a lot of friends send me pictures of it in their local bookstore. If not, the University of Chicago Press sells it and delivers it online. That will allow you to avoid Amazon if that's your thing. And cool. I'm in favor of avoiding Amazon.
Cool. Well, congrats again. Thanks for the stimulating talk, and hopefully we meet again soon.
Thanks so much, Daniel.
Thanks, everybody, for listening.